Greetings, YouTube. I read a lot of nonfiction. In fact, most of the stuff I've been reading lately is either nonfiction or gaming books. I read gaming stuff on my phone every single day. I find it the perfect take with you wherever you go kind of thing, because I can read a little snippet of a gaming book and then not worry about it because there's no narrative. Same thing with nonfiction. There's no narrative for nonfiction for the most part. And occasionally you'll bump into an author that's really good at writing as well. The book I'm reading right now, which deals with senses, like sight, hearing, that kind of thing, um, is written by a woman who's very, very talented. Her writing style is lyrical. But while covering we covered already the sense of smell, and now we're currently I'm reading about the sense of touch. She does discuss history, and she does bump into like the Greeks and the Romans, which have often been favorite topics of white people when it comes to their cultural background. Now, I've always found it fascinating that in the modern era, well, I should say modern era, from like the Enlightenment forward, probably, Europeans have loved to hold the Greek and Roman cultures dear to their chest as the foundations of things like democracy and uh, the structures of uh, governance and things like that. Except those cultures were horrible. Both the Greeks and the Romans were slave states. Flat out, they wouldn't have existed without a robust slave population that they oppressed. And yes, I know you're going to tell me, but under the Romans, they could have buy themselves free. Yeah, but they had to buy themselves out of slavery. And if you find yourself into a position where you have to put yourself into slavery, which was legal in the Roman times, um, or you have to buy your way out of it, or maybe you were born into it, maybe you get lucky and you can find your way free, you're still a slave. And if this institution of slavery exists, that that nation, that government, that institution is morally bankrupt. And the Greeks and Romans did great things. They also did horrible things. And they weren't the only people to have democracy. Democracy was something that was experienced all over the place, where people decided that they would come together communally, and you know, hash out their issues. It wasn't just something that was discovered in the Greeks and Romans, but that classical era concept was something that so many Europeans and Americans, by extension, have just loved. And you can hear modern pundits like Jordan Peterson laud the virtues of the Roman era and the Greek era and how wonderful it is. And one of the things that's always fascinated me about this is how we whitewash them. And I say we because I was guilty of this as well when I was younger. We whitewash those peoples. What do I mean by that? We literally view them as white people, when in reality, they weren't. They were not lily white Caucasians. The Roman kingdom was not white. The Roman Republic was not white. The Roman Empire was not white. Period. They were very diverse. There was a lot of brown people in these organizations, in these nations, in these eras. Um, and I know your people were going to say, well, some of the Romans were very light skinned. I said, okay. No, this is the fascinating part. After the Roman era, and we go into what is considered the Dark Ages or the early Middle Ages, depending how you want to look at it, um, there was a transition, and all of the people in the northern European regions that did become very, very white because they were living in places with no sun, um, they suddenly began to treat Greek people and Italian people, the descendants of those classical era Greeks and Romans, as others. They began to treat them as swarthy, which is a term which is horribly racist. But you hear it all the time, and you read it all the time. If you've done any kind of reading about history, and especially if you've read texts from like the 19th century and stuff. I have done quite a bit of that over the years. Yeah, but the whole swarthy thing, um, they very much saw them as others. They didn't see them as white people. White people came to mean Germans and Swedes and the British and the French, and those were white people. And the Italians and the Greeks were brown people. Remember when H.P. Lovecraft was trying to craft all those existential dread stories that he wrote? For him, existential dread was an Italian plumber moving in next door, because there are very few people that are as well known as Lovecraft who are more racist than he was. If you cannot read the Lovecraft of war without understanding that he was deeply, deeply racist. It is just that we can read it now, and at least we're not benefiting him. And so long as we keep it within that lens that, okay, we understand that this is racist, but it's also very entertaining to read, we can enjoy the work while also being honest about the creator. Um, but yeah, they were not even considered white until the mid 20th century. Maybe post World War II is when we in America began to view Italian people and Greek people as belonging to the white community. Prior to that, they weren't. And even after that era, I can remember going to school in the 80s, and Greek people were still being viewed as other. And we have a robust Greek community in New Hampshire. I've eaten a hell of a lot of Greek food in my day. They very much were viewed as the other. And yet, if you were to ask white supremacists now, they'll tell you about the lily white nature of Italians and Greek people, and how important for the foundation of the Western culture were the Germans, rather were the Romans and the Greeks and things like that, even though they were slave states, which isn't something that the white supremacists want to talk about, because they would really like to have a slave state. They would really like themselves to be the Romans and the Spartans. They really love the Spartans. Be in charge. They want to be the white people in charge, and they want all the brown and black and yellow and red people to be the slaves. That's their ideal, which is one of the reasons they laud the Romans and the Greeks so much, I think. People like Jordan Peterson will never say it out loud, but he's a deeply racist person, as well as misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic, and frankly not very bright. But he's not going to say out loud that he would like to be a slave owner. But he would. He'd love it. Maybe maybe he could actually buy people that might think of him as being worthy, because I can tell you I don't. But yeah, we have whitewashed the Romans and the Greeks. And I find it interesting that it seems to be done a lot by people who don't actually understand anything about the actual classical era, who have never read any of the history of those zones. But then again, these are the same people that think Christ is white. They think that a guy born in the Middle Ages in that era who spoke Aramaic was a white person. So I guess if they can wrap their heads around that particular piece of non-Euclidean logic, thinking the Romans and the Greeks were lily white probably isn't much of a stretch.